I'm Eric Lanigan with Lanigan&Lanigan, attorneys in Winter Park, Florida. I want to talk for a minute about how lawyers can sometimes be pigeonholed into certain categories and why you want to avoid that. And I think the most common pigeonholing, so to speak, that goes on is whether a lawyer is a litigator or a transactional lawyer. And there's a sense that the two never cross. And in many areas, that is true. You might have a lawyer who litigates real estate issues, title deficiencies, undisclosed defects on the property, and they may never do a real estate closing, because those two things can be completely separate and distinct. But there are a lot of areas where this separation should not exist, and I think the most common area is in the writing of contracts. We've been involved in so many cases where you read the contract and you listen to what the client tells you, and you're thinking to yourself, based on what he's telling me, how on earth did they end up with this document as their contract? And we just recently had a case that ended up, when you take into account both sides, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees, practically approaching $1 million in attorney's fees. And it all boiled down to, they had this beautiful, looked beautiful, 20, 30-page contract that had been written up in this quite a complex transaction. But when you listen to the client tell you about the essence of what the deal was supposed to be, and you read the contract, you just had to look up and say to the client, it's just not there. You know, there are all these beautiful paragraphs that I'm sure were cut and paste from different forms here and there, and it all flows very well, except it's not what the client had intended the contract to be. And a litigator, when they're considering a contract, is often, because he's been to court and he's litigated over contracts and he's litigated over a particular phrase, or whether the comma is at the beginning or the end, and all of those things which can change the meaning of paragraphs, is much more sensitive to the idea of whether, I should say much more sensitive to the concept of whether the written word is consistent with the mental impressions of the parties to the contract as to what they intend. And he's been to court, he's litigated these things, he's argued it in front of juries, he's listened to judges and juries comment about the language that's been used in various litigation regarding contracts. And so he's much more sensitive to, all right, if this gets into a dispute, does this really say what is on the minds of these people, or is it something that came out of a book that sounds great? And there's a big difference there, and we've found that many times when a contract is written by a lawyer who's never been in the courtroom. It's all very formal, it's all very legalistic, but it may not be the agreement that the parties had intended. That's why when we write a contract, I listen to the client about what it is they're talking about, whether it's a real estate deal, whether it's a franchise, whatever it may be. And we'll say, you know, when all is said and done, I want you to take a legal pad and forget about any legalese, forget about any structure. Just give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What is the deal supposed to be in your mind? And then you give us that, and then we're going to put together a contract based upon those elements that you've told us makes up the deal. So we're going to conform the language to your concept of the transaction you're about to enter into, rather than try to do the square peg into a round hole, which is to conform your deal to some form paragraphs out of a book somewhere. So when you're getting ready to write a contract, ask your lawyer, have you ever litigated issues like this? Have you ever been in a courtroom and dealt with litigation over these types of issues, or this type of contract that I'm entering into? Because that can be a very important aspect of whether the lawyer can really write the agreement you want. Again, I'm Eric Lanigan with Lanigan&Lanigan, attorneys, Winter Park, Florida.